So welcome again to May She Flourish. Our topic today is keys to authenticity. In just a moment, I'm going to give a brief introduction of our panelists, but right now I invite you to join me in prayer. Creator God, you have called us into ministry because in the ways in which you can see our gifts serve your goodness, you can see the ways in which our vulnerabilities can serve your love. And you can see the ways in which the whole people of who we are can raise up your people to the life in Christ. As we listen and learn today, help us to be reminded that you have called us as whole people, authentic and real in our roles, in our lives, and our relationships with one another and with you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. So our panelists today are with us. And once again, we have Manuela Castellagli, who is a professor at the University of Notre Dame. She does her research in the Wellness at Work research project, sociologist, and she has specifically in this project focused on women clergy. She was telling us as we've gone over her research that what we're discussing today is very, very important to women functioning and being in their contexts. And as always, there's much, much more that we could take from this research. We're going to be focusing on one part of it today. So hopefully many more conversations around this to come. Then with us is Altagracia Perez-Bullard. She is the professor of pastoral theology here at Virginia Theological Seminary. She has been a parish priest in the Diocese of New York, served there as their Canon for congregational development, and for the last 2 years has been teaching practical theology here at Virginia, as well as helping to form our students towards their ministries. And then we have Bishop Baskerville-Burrows. Jennifer is the diocesan bishop of the Diocese of Indianapolis. She is the first Black woman to be elected as a diocesan, and she comes with a particular set of wonderful skills, one of them being architecture. So she is having to offer the Diocese of Indianapolis ways in which they can look at their buildings and their ministries together. And I encourage you to go to the diocese's website after this because they have some very innovative and wonderful programs that they're doing together. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving the time. So Manuela, would you like to start us with your keys to authenticity research?
Sure. As usual, we start with stories, and I want to also be very clear in sharing thanks to all those who have participated and shared their stories with us. This is a very broad topic, and I can only focus on one little parcel of it. It's so important, especially for women's well-being. But I'll focus on the importance of context in authenticity. So here are two stories. The first is from Brittany. Brittany is in her late 20s, single, and her first appointment is in a small and aging congregation in the rural Midwest. The age gap between her and her parishioners is significant, as are their cultural, political, and theological differences. She's a graduate from a prestigious progressive seminary. Our new community is socially, politically, and religiously very conservative. She feels strongly called to work for social and environmental justice, but her congregation resists change and would prefer Brittany to concentrate on parishioners' pastoral care. Over her first 2 years of ministry, she transitioned from being what she calls quote, the shiny new object of her parishioners' hope to someone they look at with suspicion and resentment. The balance tipped on a Veterans Day when a parishioner displayed an American flag on the altar. A giant flag and a cross perpetually illuminated had been marking the entrance of the building for many years. Smaller flags were also a normal part of the church decor. In Brittany's mind, though, that flag on the altar finally crossed the line. She removed it. Her act marked the end of her honeymoon with her new church. The backlash forced her to confront the incongruence between her theological ideas and values and her congregation's culture. Since then, she has struggled to understand how to communicate with her parishioners while remaining true to her values and beliefs. The second story is Norma's story. Norma is a Black woman in her late 50s. She exudes confidence and authenticity, laughs easily, and does not take herself too seriously. After her ordination, her professional experience qualified her for a prestigious appointment in a predominantly white congregation in the South, where she worked for racial and economic equality. Norma perceives her call as a gift from God that requires openness to grow, especially when this implies discomfort. Her ministry is consistent with this attitude. She feels called not only to comfort, but also to challenge. Her work has made her acutely aware of a wide gap between how some parishioners see themselves, liberal, forward-thinking, and their actual behaviors and commitments. As the only Black priest on staff, she lives in a strange space where she's at the same invisible, more or less subtly ignored and challenged as a competent leader, and too visible. The first Black female priest of the congregation, too confident, too outspoken, inopportune in her questioning, and sometimes ill-fitting in the role, and somewhat ill-fitting in the role of priest. Despite all this, or maybe because of all this, Norma sees her visibility as a calling, and she embraces that calling fully. Her priestly garments proudly display her African heritage. Her appearance and emotional expressions intentionally challenge the white, masculine, and impassive ideal many consider as the proper fit and attitude for a priest. Her words and acts are a direct expression of her calling to comfort and challenge. A change of leadership and a national racial reckoning have recently broken the fragile balance that made her ministry possible in that church. She is now transitioning to a new appointment that will allow her to expand her ministry of pastoral care and racial justice. Let's delve on in these stories. In different ways, Brittany's and Norma's stories point out the problematic tension involved in reconciling a priest's identity, values, and commitments, and a congregation's specific culture. Our research shows that the clergywomen, and especially female clergy of color, are particularly exposed to the risk of being assigned to low-fit congregations. So that is, churches whose culture and theology are considerably different from theirs. This mismatching structural roots in clergywomen's job market is something we explored during the first webinar. Despite recent progress across denominations, clergywomen are still disproportionately appointed to small and declining congregations, often in rural and semi-rural areas. This is very much Brittany's case. She's young, politically and theologically progressive, and the first female leader in an aging congregation located in a conservative rural community. This gap puts her at a heightened risk of conflict with her church, especially during the pandemic. I'm sure you have heard many stories about this. Political, cultural, and theological differences have confronted many clergy with a stark choice between maintaining their integrity and keeping their job. Norma's case points out a different facet of the dilemma of clergy's authenticity. She is older and well-trained in dealing with racial and cultural differences, which helps. Nevertheless, as the first female priest of color in her congregation, she directly experiences the contradiction between her parish's stated ideals of racial justice, and an ordinary reality of more or less subtle prejudice based on her skin color and her gender. Her very identity does not exactly fit the role in many people's view. Her entire way of being, her appearance, voice, emotional expressions, and commitment to racial justice represent a constant call for the church to question assumptions and prejudices. According to our study, female and LGBTQ+ clergy, especially when they belong to racial minorities, are more likely to identify, understand, and address oppression and prejudice. A wealth of research highlights that those who experience discrimination are also, on average, more inclined to learn about and speak out against prejudice and injustices impacting other groups. This positioning implies that, especially in politically and socially conservative settings, they may experience a greater value dissonance. This finding is confirmed also by a recent study, and I quote here because I think it's important. On the whole, women pastors more readily took on controversial topics in the pulpit, emphasized inclusion, and led social justice initiatives related to issues of sexism, homophobia, heterosexism, and racism. These trends reinforce the findings of other studies demonstrating that women pastors are typically more political and social justice oriented. The data suggests that women's commitment to social justice and helping others can be attributed to their own experiences of discrimination and oppression. Why is all this important? Researchers define authenticity as an individual's perception that her behaviors are, quote, true to herself within her role and congruent with her identity, values, and commitment. This is very important. The context in which people work, in our case, a congregation, plays a significant role in determining whether they can maintain a sense of authenticity and integrity. Research shows that a negative correlation between individuals' sense of alienation from their work context and psychological well-being. Conversely, people who experience authenticity and integrity at work are more motivated and engaged, show higher levels of initiative and ownership of their role, are more satisfied with their work, and perform better. In theological term, we will say they have a stronger sense identification with their calling and they maintain it more firmly. Workplace authenticity is especially crucial for women. Why? Recent studies have explored the issue of workplace individual fit from the perspective of gender and racial or ethnic minority groups, especially in contexts that are white and male dominated. Social identity threats, what we call incidents that signal that a person is devalued by virtue of her being part of a stigmatized group, among other factors, have the potential to erode a person's sense of authenticity. If I feel I don't belong, I'm more likely to fake it, to behave in ways that are not authentic, and to give up my values. So these social threats, social identity threats, have the potential to erode a person's sense of authenticity and congruence, and considerably impact a worker's mental well-being, performance, and motivation. Finally, women and people of color often face these challenges how? By sorting themselves. They choose a work context that may represent a good fit and avoid threats. Church organizations are no exception to this tendency. Even more than their male peers, our female clergy participants, including Episcopal priests, female priests, were acutely aware of the importance of finding a good fit, much more than their male counterparts. Specifically, for instance, finding a church that may be accepting of your being a woman or you being an LGBTQ person, and or being a part of a minority group. However, clergywomen's ability to sort themselves was often limited by the dynamics of the denominational job market, an explicit or implicit bias towards men, and by practical and financial constraints. I can't wait, or I can't find something that or I can't move far away from my current place because of family constraints, for instance. So there were a number of limitations that sometimes constrain a person's ability to find a good fit, including financial pressures. Just like Brittany and Norma, most clergy women also experience some level of alienation and a social identity threat for the way they looked, sounded, behaved, or for the causes they supported, and felt pressure to appear and behave in ways that they perceived as inauthentic and inconsistent with their identity and core values. This situation, it appears clear, represents a heightened risk for the mental well-being and the continuity of their professional careers. And this is, as I said, is just a little exploration of what we have found out. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to explore directly the solutions, but this will come in the conversation. We would like to emphasize what are the elements that at a personal level, apart from finding a good fit, may help authenticity.
Manuela, thank you. Thank you for taking us through that so clearly. So my first point of conversation is for Jennifer and Altagracia, which is, do you find anything in Manuela's research that either is not borne out by your experience with women clergy, or something that you have observed that is very different from what Manuela has found? Either one of you can go first.
Sure. Well, I will begin by discussing my first impression of the concept of this webinar and then the research. At first I thought, low fit, how often does that happen? And knowing that I just would have a lot of anecdotal stories to draw on, and here across the church, women struggle with being placed by limited options in congregations that are not a right fit for them in any number of ways. So I'm grateful for having a little bit of data to be able to wrestle with this with, because we can all surface all kinds of stories and there are too many of them. And yet I think having the data helps us to think about it a little bit differently. When I first received the invitation to participate, I thought, well, I'm not sure I've had that experience. And then I thought, oh my God, my first cure was that experience. But I ended up having a good experience in it. It was hard, but really an incredible journey for me in the short 2 years I was in a church that seemed to be different from me in every way. And so I'd love to talk about that, but I just deep appreciation for how quantifying some of this anecdotal experience is important, particularly in this moment where, as you mentioned, Manuela, the possibilities for more of these low fit matches to happen is increasing in light of the downsizing of the institutional church and the impacts of the pandemic.
Yeah, I'm always a little sad. I want you to present this, Manuela, and I want to be able to say, oh no, this is not happening anymore. But unfortunately, it really is. And I do think that sometimes it happens in ways that ends up being beneficial both for the congregation and for the clergy leader, but often it's at a cost to the clergy leader, right? So that on that end, they bear the burden. And the thing that I thought you name, but I feel like the ways in which it is so compounded in women who, because of the intersectionality of their own identity, it's like, it's not and, it's like exponential, right? So the only thing I would say about it is that for, if you are a Black woman that's in a clergy position, or if you're Latina and queer, or if you're all three, right, then you make choices where some parts of you are a good fit, right? Because you made commitments to serve a certain community or culturally or historically or even economically, right? It's a middle-class parish or a working class parish, and that you resonate with that identity, that's something that you can relate to. And then there's all these other ways that then it won't match, right? So it's like you're having to prioritize parts of your own identity in order to focus on the good fit, right? To say, well, I'm making these commitments. And then to still acknowledge that there are ways that you're navigating being fully authentic, even as you try to find places that are good fits.
Manuela, do you have anything you want to add to that based on what Jennifer and Altagracia have said?
Yeah, probably. I think I introduced the character, Norma's character, because she represents a very luminous kind of example of what an individual can do to remain authentic. The first thing that I try to emphasize is this sense of calling that has to do, she has a very deep awareness of what her calling, her identity is. And authenticity starts with being very aware of what are your values, what are the things that are important to you. She's someone who comes from a racial justice advocacy background, so she knows, she has probably her own scars when she comes to that job. Not everybody does, so that's why the contrast with Brittany, who is a very young woman. I interviewed many female priests who were about that age, because we spoke with early career people, and they struggled to negotiate, but first of all, to be aware of what is their sense of calling and their sense of identity as pastors, as priests, is still forming. And so this was a particularly difficult crucible for them, more than it was probably for someone who had already an identity well formed and well identified. So this and the ability to listen to negative feedback and try to integrate it in a way that is balanced. Yes, this may be true, but this may not. And it's a process. Jennifer was saying she started in a certain way, and then she came through an evolution. And it will be interesting to know from her and from Altagracia how they evolved in that, how they found that balance of integrating, negative feedback and a clear identity about what they were and what they wanted to stay firm on.
Would either of you start to answer that, Jennifer?
Yeah, I talk often about my first congregation, which was a curacy. Oh, my frozen. Curacy position, just out of seminary, into a diocese that had adopted me in the process, and so I wasn't from there. I was sponsored by a campus ministry, so I ended up being like the only person I knew in a community, one of 4 Black people in a congregation of about 150, serving with a rector who graduated from seminary the year I was born. And so I was like, oh my goodness, why am I here? But I said yes to the bishop placing me there, right? And what I found was that my just being there became this difference. Like there was a different person who was up in the chancel all the time, being a signal of difference. And so what I ended up doing with that is just trying to figure out how to create some places of conversation about it. And so here's an anecdote. Folks would often say, this is in Endicott, New York, that we're afraid to go to the city. And I would say, well, you mean Binghamton, which is 5 miles away? And they would say, no, New York City. And I'm like, well, you don't have to go to New York City. That's far away. But also, I'm from New York City. So tell me about why you're afraid. What is that about? And we were able to talk about it because I thought, we can't have me being the priest here and having folks afraid of people who look like me. Mm-hmm. And I was 31 years old and trying to figure out how to have that conversation. And we evolved it was an impactful 2 years where I led a whole bunch of people to a trip to New York City to deal, if you're going to have to be with me here, then I want you to come and have an experience in this place where I come from, who you have called me to be your priest for the season. So there were places where there could have been high conflict in both internal and in the congregation. And the way I was able to move through that experience was to keep finding ways to turn those places of conflict into places of curiosity. Mm-hmm. So, I learned how to camp and go to speedy festivals and things like that, which is one of the local festivals there. And folks came to Manhattan and we talked about it all the time, because I could not be that person struggling on my own in that space and not being able to do something with that. So anyway, that's one of the lessons that I learned in that I think has served me well. But it was hard and it was lonely too. And I had to find other ways to get those needs met that were not a part of the congregational life. And so the questions I have about how people are being formed for ministry now have to do with our expectations of what leaders, particularly women, expect from the communities they serve, and how if there's lots of hostility, that's one thing, but there's got to be clarity about what we expect to have nurtured in us as we serve. And no congregation can do all those things anyway, but it's to be really thoughtful about how, when there's not an obvious fit, how to make sure that people are getting what they need all around, particularly the priest.
Right. Okay, thank you. So Altagracia?
In a similar way, I think that the having a strong sense of your own identity and your own call can be really, it's a place that anchors you even as you're being blown around by the winds, right? And I think, similarly, my early work in the church was not in a parish. So the first church that I served, kind of like in a clergy capacity as a salaried person, I was the rector. And I was the first woman rector in this congregation that was, everybody looking from the outside would say, oh, it's a Black and Latino congregation. You're perfect. But, there was a lot of nuance in there, right? So I'm not African American and I'm not Mexican. And even from the islands of the Caribbean, which people could identify me as a West Indian person, but you're not an English-speaking West Indian person, in terms of my heritage. And so there was a lot of tension and conflict. And I think that in the beginning, it was helpful to be able to just be clear, like, well, what do you mean? And in my case, I would love to say that it was because I approached it with a sense of curiosity. I just literally didn't understand what they meant. Like, what do you mean that, okay, so I'm Black, and then they would, but, and I was like, well, but you've had other rectors that are not African American. No, well, but this, that. And I was like, and you're from Jamaica. So, and what it ended up being was an opportunity to hold up a mirror that I could hold up. And granted, I could hold it up in a way that the interim, who had been a white male priest, could not hold it up, because I really identified with this community. But they did not see me that way. They saw me as other. And the fears and anxieties that they had about change and health and growth of their congregation seemed personified by, like, we have to settle for this woman, and then she's not even African American, and then you're like all these things. So, eventually, for me, the anecdote of the twist was when and this played itself out in all the ways the church knows how to behave badly, right? Like, there was a petition circulated to declare my call, and somehow it violated some rules, which it didn't, so I didn't go anywhere. But eventually somebody came up to me and said, I just wanted to tell you that you're actually more Black than our other Black clergy. And of course, what they were recognizing was that I was not an immigrant. I was not comparing my experience to my experience somewhere else. I identified strongly with the justice movements of the 60s and all the challenges that had happened in the 70s. So there was a way that, in this context, I really am one of you. But that took time. And I do agree, with Jennifer, that I thank God that I didn't, for whatever reasons in my own formation, in my own church life, I didn't expect them to be my primary source of support. And the fact that I did, so I've always bumped into people and been surprised, like, you thought the church was going to do that, or you thought your bishop was going to do that? Like, I mean, it was like these expectations that church, because it's a community of faith, is going to support you and hold you in a particular way, when it was not an expectation I had. I wanted us to be faithful together, but that did not mean I had to have friends. I had to have family obligate commitments. I had to have other things to sustain me, because it is a lonely place when folks have fitted certain ideals of what their perfect priest looks like. And, you don't look like it.
Yeah. So Altagracia and Jennifer, you've both actually in your own stories touched on some of the practices that get developed or that you can use when there's that conflict between who you know you are and who the congregation perceives you to be, or you are clearly different from the congregation, as in Jennifer's case. So the curiosity and the leading to the conversation, the ability not to have everything the congregation says absolutely be a mirror for you to mirror back to them what you're hearing. In Brittany's case, though, in the other story that Manuela presented, Brittany's difference and her difference in political and her age and her gender all created more conflict around her in her parish. In other words, and Manuela said this was her first call, so she didn't have a lot of these resources, I'm guessing, to draw upon. But when the conflict does come, when you're in a situation where there's clearly that tension, gap, pulling apart, how do you balance between preserving your authenticity and maintaining your commitment to what could be a potentially bad fit for the ministry?
I mean, I think I was relatively young, right? I mean, young being a very relative term. I wasn't in my 20s, but it was my first call. And this is not, I don't recommend this necessarily, but in some ways my naivete actually served me well. Like, I had a real sense, like, we are called to be a community that does these things, and it's scary and it's not the way you used to do it. But holding on to that and then naming it, right? Just naming it over and over. And people always nod, right? Like the way that it was in Brittany's story, right? Folks have a sense that what they're valuing is important for everyone, but then being challenged on how that fits into the gospel. Like, I guess I saw that as part of my role as a priest.
Okay.
But I think, and I guess then not taking it personally. Now, that doesn't mean that I did not close the door and cry in my office. I mean, that happened too. But it also happened that people said, wow, those questions or those issues were exactly what we needed to have raised. So recognizing that even in the body of Christ, there were already people doing some of that work, and they were already hoping for somebody that could support them in what they thought, the movement of the church should be. But not taking it personally is easier said than done.
Carol, I wanted to say something very quickly. When we think about authenticity, we shouldn't think about I am whatever I am, and you should just bend to that. That's not what authenticity is about. Authenticity is a dynamic in which you have an integrated and healthy view of yourself that takes into account the external feedback. It's not just about who you think you are, but it's also ability to question yourself and your ideas and to integrate them in a healthy and balanced way, and then to translate that in authentic behaviors and authentic relationships. I don't want us to think that Brittany's case is just because of your youth. Because we have learned, not necessarily in Episcopal churches, because they tend to be more politically and ideologically homogeneous, but because we are open also to other denominations. Like I see a comment from a Lutheran friend and Presbyterian friends, maybe they're more purple churches had, independently from the experience of the priest in charge, had a very, very heavy conflicts. So preserving, sometimes we have heard the stories of clergy who were really literally choosing between preaching the gospel from the pulpit and making their people, their congregation comfortable. Because sometimes, especially during the George Floyd transition, preaching from the gospel about race and about the marginalized could cost you some peace of mind in your church. So the question is really there. It is how do you sometimes, is there a choice between integrity and preserving your job?
Yeah. Jennifer, was
Oh, there's so much in there. I'm trying to figure out where to even begin, because I think there is no, I would want to believe that being an authentic and giving up your authenticity is too high a price, right? And so I'm always seeking for ways, either in the ministry that I've done in the church or help mentoring other people, is to help them find the ways in which you can continue to meet people where they are. Like, I know not everyone's going to be on the same page I'm on politically, spiritually, theologically, but I'm called to communities in which I'm led to offer what I've got out of those experiences and those leanings. And the places where those are tension points for the congregation in whatever way, again, become the places, well, let's talk about it, right? So I so deeply believe in the possibility that you've got to be able to the extent that people are willing to come to the table to talk about those differences and be curious about one another, is what enriches a community. And there are ways to be authentically who you are to do that, if it can be done in a way, if you can hold a sense of being not defended about it, and that's a hard space sometimes to hold. But I think that's the call of pastoral ministry. And so to be able to say that there are places where I've served in churches where the flags went down the aisle every Sunday, the American flag, the Episcopal flag, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to let that go, because we're going to still talk. We're going to instead talk about how we get some lift every voice and sing hymnals in the pews, and we did that. So there are places in which not everything can be tackled all the time. And sometimes I think when everything feels like everything's conflictual because it's so different, there's a need to kind of step back and to say, okay, I've got gifts to bring. Whoever you are, you've got a gift to bring, and to figure out how to bring those gifts in ways over time that can help build your way to the other. And then but it doesn't work unless you're going to understand like where this other person's coming from. And so, I've had conversations with people who support the KKK. I've had conversations with people who don't believe in Black Lives Matter being a helpful thing to the movement of the church. And we disagree. And we're in the same church. And so I invite those people to lunch. I'm like, let's sit down and talk about it and stay in the conversation, because I'm not going to not be Black. And you may change your mind or not, but it does us no good to be mad about it and to be not being who we truly are. And so it's messy and it takes a long time. There's no quick fix. And sometimes these curacies or calls that we're called to a community are not long enough to see some of the fruits of those efforts. But I think that's the call, is to say, okay, you got, if you can get one conversation coming, then you can have a chance to learn and make some shift happen.
In these personal stories, we touched on two of the themes that we wanted to get to, which is what happens in a highly charged situation where the diversity is really obvious. What do you let go of? What do you accommodate? So thank you both for talking about that, and Manuela, for you pointing out that it's not always being new to the ministry that creates that. I want to ask one more question, and then we've got some questions in the Q&A that I want to get to. But to what extent do you think seminaries or ministry training resources can better equip clergy to walk that line between integrity and accommodation?
Oh, gee. So I do think that some of it, and this may fall a little bit under the like veil of, because I'm a hammer, everything looks like a nail, or the other way around, whichever way that goes. But I do think that it is important for seminaries and other institutions that are working at forming and supporting leaders in their development to really press the fact that they are leaders of organizations. I mean, I think that that's important. And the reason I say that is because, like all of us who went to seminary or are enrolled in some other form of preparation for ministry, the first love, right, the passion that got us there had nothing to do with organizational conflict and running vestry meetings and dealing with budgets, right? That was not the thing. We didn't that's not what we signed up for. But helping folks to see that even in the ways that they manage conflict and the way that they support people through difficult changes, the way that they get people to have conversations across those thorny differences is part of the ministry of reconciliation and new life and renewal that they felt called to, I think is really important for folks to not equate a pastoral ministry with a chaplaincy ministry. And to recognize that to be pastoral sometimes means that you're a little bit of a lightning rod, and that's how things get played out so that people can actually see it because they can't see it otherwise. And then an invitation to engage it honestly in light of the gospel, right? Always going, like people want to go all the other places, but to bring it back to the gospel as the way, okay, we are an organization, but we are an organization dedicated to this mission. And so then how are we doing that? And I only say that just because I do feel like sometimes we are a little conflict averse, right? And so we don't use the conflict as a creative churning up of things that must be cleaned up in order for new things to grow. And I think people who think they're called for the priesthood and to pastorate needs to know that that's part of that work, I think.
So I would love to do a whole webinar just on that one piece, spiritual leadership for organizations, congregations. But I want to make sure we get to this Q&A because there's we've got three really good questions here. And the first one is, how do we combat good fit being used against us? I am a Black queer woman awaiting first call in the ELCA, and I chose authenticity during my internship. That led to it ending early due to a great conflict with my racist white male supervisor. I now wait as my bishop and others use the phrase good fit as a rationale for finding a place for me.
Okay.
Go ahead, Bishop.
Because I just, I have so many feelings just reading that question and going, it's, I just heartbreak for that. And what your experience has been, and yet I think good fit may not be the right term. And so, I spend a lot of time every day as a bishop getting in the weeds of the transitions in our diocese. And my successor may be mad about it when I retire, but I feel like it is some of the most important work that I do to make sure that as best we can, we're helping people find calls that are the best chance we have for resonance. And so, there is no perfect fit. There is no perfect call. They're looking and waiting for that doesn't get us anywhere, but we do know when things are really not a good fit, and it's unfaithful to make those calls anyway. And so I think there's a different conversation to be had about what we think we're doing when we're trying to bring congregations and clergy together, and I think it demands a lot of time, and we as a church don't think we have the time, but I just know that when we don't spend the time up front, we spend way more on the other side of it with unhappy clergy and unhappy congregations. And so let's use different terms than good fit, perhaps, but to be thinking about like, what is the right call? And it doesn't necessarily come in the packages we might think. Maybe there are different questions we need to be asking as we're trying to help folks find their way and discern their way to each other.
Great. Thank you. Manuela, you've got your hand up, and I want to get to our two other questions. Oh, I think you're still muted.
Very quickly, I hope. I just wanted to say, Christina, we asked the question. My heart really goes out to her because the word authenticity sometimes is, I mean, I think especially LGBTQ priests and clergy are asked to be even too authentic, in the sense that during job interviews, there is nobody else who is asked, who is there to have to spill out intimate details about what their love life looks like. They have to say they are LGBTQ. And so this is something that is even an excess of authenticity and an abuse of authenticity in a way. You have to be always there and always sharing your private life. And that absolutely understand that. But and I praise really Jennifer saying there is a lot of effort that goes into exploring and discerning. And I wonder if something more can be done by church leaders across the board, not to help churches discern what are their blockages when they look for a new pastor or a new priest, because there are many churches that have a first-time female leader, or first-time leader of color, or first-time LGBTQ person. We ask the priest to adapt to the potential blockages, but we don't have a process for the church to mature, to almost a curriculum, I would say, to help those people explore potential bias and overcome that while they are exploring a new fit with a priest. And I leave that open. Could there be a space for a curriculum for congregations who are exploring a new hire to explore that also in terms of their possible bias and have a moment of discernment that also covers those matters. And I'll shut up.
Thank you. Thank you. The second question that's here is, what about when misogyny, not political difference, is at the root of a bad fit? How do you handle conflict when the root cause may be something that the parish itself can't even admit to itself and would never admit publicly? Manuela, you touched on that a little bit when you said, we don't have a process where the congregation learns how to engage with difference, but the priest is expected often to be the person that is leading them into that. And it can be hard to be the person who does both. So what do you, any thoughts?
I do think that, the key to that question for me is the things that they're not willing to see about themselves. And I do think that it's an important, just as people do in pastoral counseling settings, right? It's an important thing to hold up a mirror for communities about what it is, that they're saying. Like, sometimes it's a simple, none of these things are simple, but sometimes it's as clear as repeating to people what they just said with a very confused look on your face. Like, I love my confused look for so da-da-da-da-da, right? Like, you said that because, and then ask them what they mean about it, help them, invite them to unpack it. And it's not because you're going to change their mind, but because I think, as you named very accurately, half the time these are unchallenged, unquestioned biases that they experience as normative. And so to even ask the question is to say that something is wrong or something is odd, something about this is not okay, and that's why I'm naming it. But again, that of course, I mean, that, and to pick which ones you're going to do, you can't do them all, right? But with key people, especially folks in the congregation that seem especially supportive, but are still saying things that are gender biased or sexist, or perpetuate the sense of this is really a man's work. To name, like, well, you know, it's interesting that I wonder why you say that, because when I hear it, it sounds like you're saying that only a man could do that, or that a man, you know, just to ask the question, because I do think that, not to excuse it, but I do think that these are blind spots. And so helping people to see is part of the process.
Can I just quickly name too that there's the person in the center of this doesn't have to do all of the talking and the teaching. And so we're a networked church, not just the Episcopal Church, but across denominations. And I think with misogyny or whatever the bias is the perfect time to bring in someone who's the white guy who can talk about misogyny, or who can preach about it, or to have these other voices, so it's not just centered on the priest who feels like they're at the center of it, right? Like, normalize the conversation with other voices.
Here's another question, and then another one has come in. I wonder what personal practices the panelists have that help them to practice their own authenticity on a daily basis.
I'll just say quickly, I just live, I mean, you know, you've got to also just live your life, right? Like, be who you are and dwell in those places that make you happy and bring you joy. But as bishop, what I find myself doing as I go around the diocese and try to be my authentic self is, and I don't often have a lot of time to do that, is that I tell people what they're going to get, right? So my first year, when I was trying to help people get to know me, I would say, I'm from Brooklyn. I don't know how to do Indiana nice. I'm going to tell you what I think so that no one's going to be surprised when I do that, right? Because that's authentically who I am. And that was a piece of just honest sharing, maybe a little bit of vulnerability that helped me to not have to worry about thinking about being authentic. It's just to pave the way for, like, this is who I am, and I want to get to know who you are. And that kind of being together with people every day, reinforcing just this is who I am, helps me to not be bifurcated or incoherent in my soul as I seek to lead in the church.
And I think it takes work to create a supportive network for yourself, and it takes work to have friends that are outside of church. And so don't take, I mean, not to take seriously that's work. You're gonna have to put it in your agenda. You're gonna have to block off time. You're gonna have to research the places where people are doing the things that you're interested in, because otherwise it is so easy to just do work all the time. And I get that it's ministry and it's part of our identity and it's part of who we are. But what gives it its passion and its vitality is that I like to dance, and I like to cook, and I like to crochet, and I play phone games way too much. Like, right, that these other things that help me relax, that help me be myself with others, that allow me to get away and get perspective, retreat, prayer, exercise, all the things. And the sad thing is that when it gets hard, it really is all the things at the same time. When we were going through this COVID thing, I felt like, whoa, the one thing I will have gotten from COVID is, like, my spiritual practices are on point, because I just couldn't get through the day without doing all the things. So when you're in a hard situation in some of these ministry places, where as a woman and all the other things that may come in, you need all the things. And that means taking time. And that means somebody asking you why you're taking that time. And then you quote Jesus. I'm all about quoting Jesus. And Jesus said he took some time apart by himself, away from his disciples.
All right. So there's other good questions that we were not able to get to, but we'll do our best to send response out to those, and the resources. You will all get an email in about a week with the recording, and also with the resources that we've gathered from this webinar. So Manuela, we're at almost at the conclusion. So as we have had this discussion, what would you like to leave us with? You're on mute still.
I would like to re-emphasize even if there is no necessity for that, what Altagracia was just saying. Please preserve this complexity in your life that is not, and try to differentiate from your work as a minister, and preserve spaces in which you can cultivate your spirituality. And remember, one of the most important things that we saw in our clergy that was beneficial in our participants was retelling your calling story, reaffirming, remember who you are. And I mean, it looks almost like a biblical practice, but it is speak about why you are there and in what way you are uniquely called, and take time and space to remember that and to find strength in that. Many of the clergy we interviewed had very little time, actually, especially now, to cultivate a spiritual space, or to be simply what Altagracia was saying: dance, play, take time to rest and to sleep, and to remember that you are a human being and not only a ministry machine, I would say. So that is very important, and particularly for single people, that is important because they tend to be absorbed by their ministry. That was the case for Brittany. She lived in a parsonage, she was single. So single people, take good care of yourself in particular, because that's a risk for them, but for anybody.
Well, thank you, Manuela. As I've said, I hope we have other discussions just coming from this topic of authenticity. Thank you, Altagracia, and thank you, Jennifer, for being with us, and your wisdom and your practices of ministry. And I want to let you know about our next webinar, which will be on February 2nd. This is what a pastor looks like, being a pastor in a female body. So we'll be taking on another aspect of Manuela's research and talking about it again. So thank you all for being here today. And I hope that this was a way in which you were fed and nurtured in your ministry.